Howdy, hey folks. It is Mrs. Johnson with the Agro Wisdom channel. We are doing FFA lullabies, bedtime stories again. Let's see. We are still on the cattle country of Peter French. I am using a new recording program. I am going to order a new camera soon because now that I'm recording me reading, I feel like my lovely college laptop camera is struggling a little just to pick up the good photos in this book and some of the things that I'm trying to demonstrate. So we're gonna get a webcam soon. Yay, upgrades. Let's see. Oh, I got my snacks. I got my drink. I got my blankie. It is the same blankie as last time. And I got a new stuffy today. This is my little monster. Anyway, it is Christmas today for me. And I finally got home, started recording things, and now I'm going to read some stuff because I like reading in my free time. And I'm pretty excited to share the next chapter with you. It's a longer chapter. So we're going to read it out loud, take a break, show you some photos in the next video, and then start a new chapter. Hopefully, fingers crossed today. And separate those accordingly. But we'll see how far we get today before I want to mosey off and go to bed. But that's my goal. We are on California Beginnings. There's YouTube videos of the last couple chapters, so if you need a review, go pop over there. But without further ado, I'm going to jump in. California Beginnings. When young French felt himself old enough to go out into the world to make his own living, he naturally headed down the Sacramento River, towards the center of population and greater agricultural activity. He entered the employ of Dr. Hugh James Glenn at Jacinto, an aggressive promoter and fellow Missourian known to Bree French in that state and in Colusa County. Glenn was to become the man to exert the greatest influence on Peter French. In fact, the story of one cannot be told without the other. Dr. Glenn was born in Virginia, near Staunton, September 18th, 1824. He earned a medical degree and served for a time as a doctor in the Mexican War. Agriculture stuff happened in the Mexican War. As a side note, life in the army did not appeal to him. He resigned his commission to find more profitable adventure. After his marriage to Nancy Harrison Albertnethy, a small and not well-favored woman, in March of 1849, he bought some livestock and drove them across the prairies to California, which in 1849 was adventure enough for almost anyone. Because the West was short on domestic stock, he sold his herd for a good price. Gold had been discovered the year before at Sutter's Mill, and Americans were flocking to the new land as fast as ships and wagons could take them. Prices were what the seller dared ask. As a side note, my family came to California for similar stuff. We came to California to do agriculture instead of gold. And now my family's kind of in the timber industry, sort of, because I'm in Northern California and that's what we have here. But anyway, a side note over. We'll jump back into reading. Hughes James Glenn was a man about 5 feet 8 inches in height, erect, aggressive, and red-bearded. He did not call himself a doctor, nor did he practice medicine in his mature life, except in emergency. He did not pose as a farmer or a stockman. Rather, he called himself a trader and gave that as his occupation when registering to vote. His family consisted of 9 children, not all of whom reached maturity. I wonder what maturity means in this. I don't know. Anyway. Among them was Ella, born in 1860 and destined to become Peter's wife. and a person of endless controversy. Dun dun dun! Drama time. Glenn was an indulgent father, giving his family everything they asked for, and demanding nothing in return. Because he was seldom home with them, they grew up to be just the kind of children such treatment nearly always produces. None had their father's ability to organize or to accept responsibility. However, all developed his quality of spending money. In 1814, at the age of 25, Glenn started a lifetime of promotion, the same year that Peter French, who was to be a major instrument in his ambition, was born. Getting derailed. 2 seconds. Please and thank you. Not derailed anymore. Never tempted into gold digging, Glenn returned several times to Missouri for more stock. He made at least a dozen trips, bringing cattle, horses, and on occasion sheep to the new country. He was successful enough to establish himself as a promoter of promise, known to money lenders and businessmen in San Francisco. That booming city was the center of mercantile activity for the mines in California and Nevada. Its foremost citizens piled up early fortunes, selling supplies to the miners who were willing to pay high prices for the picks they swung and the bacon they ate. The gold fever was on, and men must dig. The one-time doctor allied himself with those who took their gold second-hand and certain. He was bold and resourceful, with the nerve to tackle any proposition that promised a good return. In 1867, he was living in Yolo County, on Putah Creek, where he was in partnership with S.E. Wilson, who had married Mrs. Glenn's sister, but Glenn was looking for a larger opportunity. Such opportunity came in November of the same year, when he could buy a part of the Jansen Co. grant, some 7,000 acres of land lying in northern Colusa County, which the heirs of the original Spaniard owner would not farm and could not retain. Their way of life did not include attention to agriculture. Wealth had made them accustomed to and adept at spending, not earning, and they had to sell to the hungrier, more ambitious Americans. Nearly all the Spanish grants were bought for similar reasons, as the influx of new residents into California raised the price of land far above its value to the luxury-loving Spaniards. The United States had obtained possession of California in 1848 by treaty with Mexico, and its citizens soon acquired actual ownership of the land. The price of the Jansen Co. grant was $1.60 per acre, which in this day seems moderate enough. For $11,200, Dr. Glenn owned a tract of level land adjacent to the Sacramento River that would graze a sizable herd of cattle or sheep. He was able to borrow such funds as he needed for the purchase, as well as for the improvement and expansion. Time out, pause. Let's talk about California landscaping for a minute in terms of topography. So Colusa County is like central California. Like big ag stuff still happens there. Yolo County, I believe, is also big in ag, still Central Valley, I believe. And the Sacramento River is the biggest river in California. I don't live on the Sacramento River. I live off one of the tributaries of the Sacramento River that feeds into Sacramento River. But Sacramento River essentially runs straight-ish down the middle, north-south, straight down the middle of the Central Valley, and it's flat on both sides, and it's been dominated by agriculture since we got here because it's flat. Some of it's wetlands, but some of it we've adapted into not wetlands. Some of it still is But that's where you find most of the agriculture is in that valley because it's actually riverbed at one point in time, and it would flood and it get super full of nutrients and stuff, and driving down I-5 or 99 or any of those north-south highways in the Central Valley, like in like a large part of California, you'll see it. It's full of ag. You'll hit towns, but like when there's not towns, it's just agriculture land for miles and miles and miles for as far as you can see, and it's really flat. But anyway, just to give you kind of some context into what's happening in California and the landscape, because I know not everyone has seen it. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, time out, over. Back to reading. Glenn's career for the next 15 years was one of the most fabulous in the history of all California. The doctor soon increased his holdings by buying the remainder of the Jacinto, along with other grants. He raised horses and mules and cattle, until he discovered that the broad river bottom would grow wheat, which was in demand to make the flour needed for the population of the ever-growing state. Before long, he earned the reputation of being the Wheat King, especially after 1879, when a bumper crop on his 45,000 acres yielded 1 million bushels. I forgot to Google bumper crop, but bumper crop, from what I know, is like tail end, so either a spring or a fall crop instead of like the spring to fall crop. Don't quote me on that, but just for context. Dr. Glenn was a great builder. It was said that he had 38 horses, 27 barns, 14 blacksmith shops on his ranch, and that his gang plows traveled all day in a straight line, so long was his ranch. He was always building and buying houses and barns and sheds and warehouses and stores, and the machinery needed to cultivate his acres. Farm machinery then was crude and heavy, and as there was not much of it in the West, Glenn imported it from the eastern states, buying it in quantity and having it specially built. He had the advantage of developing the ranch according to his own ideas, no one before having laid out any fields or erected any buildings. It was all new. Now, new agriculture builds, very true. It's really, you get to like create a whole new world the way you want it. In terms of the machinery and importing machinery, there's a lot of places that still do that. Like the fruit and nut industry, there's really niche machinery that goes into that. And there's only like 1 or 2 companies, maybe 3 or 4 globally that do things like nut shakers and pickup machines and stuff like that for like walnuts and almonds and things like that. And so like this specific paragraph is not uncommon even now to have acres and acres of stuff that one person owns, and they're importing stuff and blah 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 blah. So we see this trend throughout agriculture and throughout agricultural history. Back to it. Among Glenn's first constructions was a magnificent residence near what is now Sid's Landing, on the west bank of the Sacramento River, east and north of Willows, a town that came into being largely because of the development of the Jacinto Ranch. The house was finished in the ornate style of the period, with no thought of expense. The doctor was on the way up, and intended that his home reflect his position and his ambition. His home was not only a residence, but an advertisement of his success, as were many of the big homes built by prosperous first settlers. It had 3 stories and 22 rooms, many of which boasted marble fireplaces to heat the high ceilings that were in fashion. There were porticos, tall windows, and carved woodwork. The marble came from Italy. The masons and carpenters of San Francisco were from San Francisco, and they were given a free hand to decorate the house to the best of their ability. The grounds were adorned with trees of many kinds, some brought from long distances, and they were planted in a wide lawn where several hundred persons could recline in the shade and be regaled with cooling drinks or more stimulating refreshments. It was altogether a home befitting a man who had set out to become a commercial king. Between the big house and the river, Dr. Glenn built a huge brick warehouse, which became the office and store for the ranch. Here were dispensed the tobacco and clothing that several hundred men had to buy there or do without. Here were written the orders for machinery and repairs, as well as the endless supplies needed for the vast enterprise. This was headquarters. Around and about were the barns to shelter the thousands of horses and mules that were used to till the fields. Here were the corrals where new animals were broken to ride and work, and here were the bunkhouses of the workers. Today the Glen Mansion stands a wreck, covered with overgrowing vines and shadows by the trees that once decorated it. Its windows are broken, and decay is evident throughout. Chickens wander through its many rooms, clucking and making nests in the marble fireplaces, where once ladies discreetly warmed their shins, and men dropped ashes from imported cigars. The present farmer of the land lives in a modest house nearby, disdaining the once festive mansion. The practice of Jancinco was to hire Mexican and Chinese labor, likely because it was cheaper and more easily managed. The Americans who came to the West in the middle years of the 19th century were an independent lot who preferred to do something for themselves rather than work for others, especially for those whose disciplines were strict. Foreign labor was steadier, less independent. However, foremen, of whom the ranch never had enough, were usually Americans, experienced with horses and men. Mexican and Chinese labor in the very beginnings of California is very common. We'll find that out as you read more and more. I learned a lot of that as I did field trips and things and blah, 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 and went to school and learned about my local ag in a place where there's not a lot of ag in Northern California, in the mountains. There's a lot more on Chico, so I learned quite a bit there. I got to see a lot of stuff hands-on. It was really cool. Anyway, back to reading. Colusa County was in the process of change. It had been grazing land before Glenn plowed some of it and began raising good crops of wheat. Others followed suit until stockmen had no place to run their cattle and sheep. Many stockmen owned little land, running their animals on the public domain, as was the custom in nearly all of the West. But the public domain was rapidly becoming private land. There was demand for meat, but there was a greater demand for flour. So great was the need for food that there was more money to be made in agriculture than in grazing. More money to be made in plants than animals is another way to put that. Some cattlemen, as a result, began to move away from Colusa County, as well as other counties in the Sacramento Valley. Glenn himself had bought a cattle spread in Paiute Valley, Nevada, which he stocked in partnership with E. Waller Crutcher, who was to receive a third of the increase for his services as manager. Descendants of Crutcher say the venture was not successful and he made nothing from it. The big stockmen were none too quick. California politicians, like politicians everywhere, were responsive to the majority, and the new men flocking to the Golden State wanted land for themselves. This meant the end of open-range cattle grazing along the Sacramento River. On March 28, 1872, the legislature approved a law marked formally as CCLV III. I don't know what that is in Roman numerals, because I don't know Roman numerals that well. which specifies that within 30 days there should be made a list of brands in each county, and that justices of the peace should all receive a copy. Thereafter, it was decreed any owner or occupant of land, whether not enclosed, may take up and safely keep, at the expense of the owner, any animal found trespassing upon said land. He shall be allowed, for each day, 20 cents for cattle, 10 cents for hogs, and 5 cents for sheep, and damages. The descriptions of the animals was to be posted. Now, this law is interesting because we also have like cattle wrestling laws and stuff like that that are evolving and have always been there, and this open range concept, and so things are changing in the world of agriculture, like quite significantly in California specifically, and so it's important to keep track of that. Back to reading. No stockman could operate under such law, and presumably that is what the legislatures intended, or at least what the backers of the bill intended. It meant that any man, landowner, or leasee could take up stock and hold them for damages and feed. This was at a time when cattle were being grown on the open range in Montana and Wyoming for $1 or $2 a year, which made the $6 a month for care of impounded cattle plus damages an impossible hazard. Furthermore, enforcement was in the hands of the small property owner or resident, who might feel the need for a little extra income. Posting could easily be done in some inconspicuous place that the stockman would not notice till the bill was large enough to suit the holder of the stock. Now, this is also at a time where meat is not as readily transportable as it is now. You can't just throw it in a refrigerated truck and buy it at a grocery store. You have to actually harvest it where you buy it, because there's not cars and stuff. So, anyway, food for thought for you. California cattlemen began looking towards Oregon for new grazing lands. They had read about the victories of General George Crook when he drove the Indians back to the reservations up in that state. And after the Civil War, the army lost little time in corralling the Paiutes and the Banooks that had got out of hand when the federal troops were removed to fight the war. Local detachments had been ineffective against them. By the late 1860s, army forts had been established at Bidwell in Surprise Valley, at Warner on Honey Creek, and at Harney near the mouth of the Rattlesnake Creek, and at the foothills at the foothills of the Blue Mountains. There were also numerous camps from which a body of troops could operate when necessary. The troublesome Paiutes were on the Malheur River Reservation in Grant and Baker, which is now Harney and Mohair counties, and the Banooks on the reservation in Idaho. Chief Winnemucca, grown old and peaceable, and his daughter Sarah, once a white man's bride, wanted them to stay there. Everything considered, Oregon seemed a suitable place to which cattle could be moved. Contrary to rumor and some writers, it is doubtful if Dr. Glenn or the other stockmen who moved to Oregon knew about the Oregon Swamp Act. The Oregon legislature did not pass an enabling act for acquisition of swampland until 1870, and it was 1872 before the filings were reported in official documents. I don't know why they added that. I'm a little confused, but we're going to figure it out. Glenn had been able to hire Peter French when that young man came down from Tehama County. Tehama County is in Northern California. He set him to breaking horses at Jinsenko. Peter had grown up on a ranch. He knew stock and was of the disposition to work for his employer's interests. He was an ally of the boss instead of a mere employee, because within a few months he became a favorite of the Mexican vaqueros and teamsters. He was made a foreman in charge of them. Peter learned to speak their language. He earned their respect. Those who knew Peter French well respected him and trusted him implicitly. No other cattleman engendered such loyalty among his crew. No other cattleman gave such loyalty to his friends. He was a man who offered full assurance and protection and aid, of physical and spiritual support. Because strong men have strong friends and strong enemies, persons outside of French's circle of friends sometimes became enemies, but they did not lose their respect for his abilities. French could get things done. The abilities of Dr. Glenn did not run to detail, at which French was particularly adept. Glenn liked French, and the younger man learned the elder's strategy and tactics. He made Glenn his economic and spiritual godfather. By 1872, French had been in the Glenn employ for 2 or 3 years, and he seemed content to remain. He had registered to vote in Colusa County when he became 21, giving his name as Peter, probably bestowed on him by the Mexicans instead of the John William his parents had christened him as. He appeared a likely young man with too much integrity to steal and too much loyalty to branch out for himself after a few years of working for another. He had just turned 23. I'm 23. Age enough for added responsibility in that century when Americans matured young. As grazing lands became scarcer, Glenn found it necessary to move his cattle from Jacinto. He did not want to sell them, for the cattle business was profitable. Like some of the other large stockmen, he decided to expand into Oregon. To head the drive, he selected young Peter French. There is no reason to believe that Glenn sent French to Oregon with 1,200 head of grade shorthorn cows, some better bulls, and about 20 saddle horses, with any other intent than to expand his business and make a profit. To intimidate that Glenn was motivated by a sentimental attachment to the young man, who had already proved his ability to handle men and stock, is to misunderstand the doctor. He acted almost entirely from self-interest. Besides, French shows promise of having the aggressiveness, the organizational ability, perhaps the ruthlessness to be a success in a new territory. The risk was comparatively small. The reward might be manifold, not only in money but in prestige, which could ensure credit and raise the pushing promoter and his family into a position of even higher social and economic standing. Neither French nor Glenn knew about the region in Oregon where the cattle were taken, even assuming that they had decided on the exact location. The problems of climate, grass, and distance from supplies were to be French's to solve. To him, the move north was adventure. To Glenn, it was speculation. Peter French likely had little contact with the Glenn family while he worked at Jacinto. Except for the doctor himself, it was not customary for the Glenns to associate with the employees, and he did not mingle with them socially. The Glenns lived in the big house and enjoyed themselves as landowners. The sweaty foreman, smelling of horses, did not fit into such company. That is the last of this chapter, so I'm going to let you go. I'm going to show you some pictures in the next video from this chapter. So, we'll be back.